The town of Brimstone Parish sat in a valley where the morning fog never quite lifted, even in summer. By October of 1882, that fog had become something darker, heavier, as if the grief of 14 dead children had given it weight and substance. The people moved through it like ghosts themselves, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes fixed on the ground as they walked the dirt roads between their farms and the church. Elijah Thorne had lived in Brimstone Parish for 32 years, all of his life. He was a tall man, lean as a hickory branch, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes that seemed to be always searching for something just beyond reach. He worked the timber mill with his father and 2 younger brothers, spending his days among the screaming saws and the smell of fresh-cut pine. His hands were calloused and scarred from years of handling rough wood and sharp tools. He lived alone in a small cabin on the western edge of the parish, near where the forest grew thick and dark. His mother had died when he was 12. His father had remarried a woman from Chattanooga who never quite fit into the rhythms of Brimstone Parish and who looked at Elijah with something like suspicion in her eyes. So, when Elijah turned 20, he'd built himself a cabin and moved into it, preferring solitude to the tension of his father's house. The people of Brimstone Parish knew Elijah as a quiet man, neither friendly nor unfriendly, neither particularly good nor particularly bad. He attended church every Sunday, sitting in the back row with his hat in his hands. He paid his debts. He helped neighbors when they needed an extra pair of hands for barn raising or harvest. But he never married, never courted any of the young women who might have had him. There was something in Elijah that remained separate, untouchable, as if he were saving himself for some purpose he alone could see. When the fever came, Elijah watched it spread through the parish with a horror that twisted something deep in his chest. He saw Sarah Brennan's face at little Margaret's funeral, saw how her eyes had gone empty and distant, as if part of her soul had followed her daughter into the ground. He saw Thomas Carver carry his twin sons to the church cemetery in a single pine box, because the family couldn't afford 2. He saw Rachel McAllister lose her mind with grief after her youngest boy died, saw her wandering the roads at night, calling his name, until her husband had to lock her in the house for her own safety. And Elijah began to think. He began to remember the sermons he'd heard all his life in the old Providence Church, sermons about sacrifice and redemption, about how the righteous must suffer so that others might be saved. He remembered the story of Abraham and Isaac, of how God had tested Abraham's faith by demanding his son. He remembered how Jesus had died on the cross to wash away the sins of mankind. Elijah started spending his evenings in his cabin, with his mother's old Bible open on the table before him, reading by candlelight until his eyes burned. He read about Job, who had lost everything and still praised God. He read about the prophets who had suffered and bled and died to bring God's message to the people. He read until the words began to blur together, until they became not just stories but instructions, a map for what he must do. By late October, Elijah had come to a conclusion that felt as solid and real as the floor beneath his feet. The fever, the drought, the suffering of Brimstone Parish, these were not random misfortunes, they were punishments. God was angry and God demanded payment. God demanded a sacrifice. And Elijah Thorne, alone in his cabin with his mother's Bible and his racing thoughts, decided that he would be that sacrifice. He would give his life willingly, just as Jesus had done. He would die so that the children of Brimstone Parish might live. He would become a martyr, and his death would lift the curse from this place, he had no doubt. The certainty filled him like light, burning away every question, every hesitation. This was what he had been born for. This was why he had always felt separate from others, why he had never married or made a life beyond his solitary cabin. He had been chosen. The first person Elijah told about his decision was Reverend Josiah Pierce, the minister of Old Providence Church. It was a Sunday evening in early November, after the congregation had dispersed, and the church stood empty except for the 2 men. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the tall windows, and the air inside the church was cold enough to see breath. Elijah had waited until everyone else had gone. He'd stood outside in the churchyard, watching families walk down the hill toward their homes, watching the Reverend move through the church extinguishing candles. When the last family had disappeared around the bend in the road, Elijah had walked up the wooden steps and through the door. Reverend Pierce was a man of 55, with silver hair and a face lined by years of sun and worry. He had served Brimstone Parish for 20 years, had baptized most of the children who now lay in the cemetery, had married their parents, had buried their grandparents. The fever had aged him. His shoulders now curved forward as if bearing invisible weight, and his sermons had become shorter, quieter, as if he no longer believed his own words could reach heaven. He looked up when Elijah entered, surprise crossing his face. The church door closing echoed through the empty space. Elijah walked down the center aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet from where the Reverend stood near the pulpit, and for a moment neither man spoke. The Reverend broke the silence first. His voice was gentle, cautious. He asked Elijah if something was wrong, if he needed help with something. The timber mill had been struggling with the drought, he knew. Perhaps Elijah needed assistance, needed the parish to help him through hard times. Elijah shook his head. He said he'd come to talk about something else entirely, something important. His voice was steady, calm, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of lumber. He said he'd been reading the Bible, studying it carefully, and he'd come to understand something about the suffering in Brimstone Parish. Reverend Pierce's expression shifted to concern. He gestured to the front pew, suggesting they sit and talk properly, but Elijah remained standing. He needed to say this standing up, needed to speak the words with the weight they deserved. Elijah explained his theory. He spoke about divine punishment and divine mercy, about how God tested his people through tribulation. He talked about Abraham and Isaac, about Job, about the prophets and martyrs who had given everything for the sake of others. His words came faster now, gaining momentum, as if once started they couldn't be stopped. Then Elijah said what he'd come to say. He told Reverend Pierce that he understood what God wanted. He understood that someone needed to die willingly, to offer themselves as Abraham had been willing to offer Isaac. He said that he, Elijah Thorne, would be that offering. He would take his own life as a sacrifice, and when he did, God would lift the curse from Brimstone Parish. The rains would come, the fever would end, the children would stop dying. The Reverend's face went pale. He stood quickly, his hand reaching out as if to physically stop the words coming from Elijah's mouth. He said that wasn't how God worked, that suicide was a sin, that Elijah was misunderstanding Scripture in a dangerous and terrible way. But Elijah was calm, immovable. He said he'd expected the Reverend to react this way. He said most people wouldn't understand, couldn't understand, because they hadn't been chosen as he had been chosen. He wasn't asking for permission. He was simply informing the Reverend of what would happen, so that when it did happen, the people of Brimstone Parish would understand the meaning of it. Reverend Pierce tried everything. He argued theology, cited passages that contradicted Elijah's interpretation. He appealed to reason, asking Elijah to think about his family, his brothers, his father. He begged Elijah to reconsider, to pray more, to wait and see if God revealed another path. Elijah listened patiently to all of it. Then he thanked the Reverend for his time and turned to leave. Reverend Pierce didn't sleep that night. He sat in the small house beside the church, his wife Mary asleep in the next room, and he stared at the darkness beyond his window, trying to decide what to do. Elijah Thorne's words kept circling through his mind, relentless as carrion birds. The calm certainty in the man's voice, the terrible, twisted logic of his plan. By dawn, the Reverend had made his decision. He would go to Elijah's father, Samuel Thorne, and together they would convince Elijah to abandon this madness. Samuel was a hard man, stern and unyielding, but he loved his sons in his own rough way. Surely he could reach Elijah where the Reverend's words had failed. The Reverend walked to the Thorne family property as the sun rose, his coat pulled tight against the November cold. The Thorne house sat on good land near the river, a solid two-story structure with a barn and several outbuildings. Samuel had built a successful timber business over 30 years, employing a dozen men from the parish and supplying lumber to towns as far away as Nashville. Samuel was already awake, standing in his barn checking on the horses. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from decades of physical labor. His hair had gone iron gray, and his face was weathered as old leather. When he saw Reverend Pierce approaching, he straightened, immediately wary. People didn't visit at dawn unless something was wrong. The Reverend told him everything. He spoke quickly, urgently, describing Elijah's visit to the church, his plan for sacrifice, his unshakable conviction that his death would save the parish. Samuel listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each sentence. When the Reverend finished, Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he cursed, low and vicious. He said Elijah had always been strange, always had his head in the clouds, always thinking thoughts that made no sense to practical men. But this was beyond strange. This was insanity. The two men walked together to Elijah's cabin. The morning was grey and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The path through the woods was muddy from morning dew, and the trees stood bare and skeletal against the dim light. Elijah's cabin appeared through the trees, small and solitary, smoke rising from its chimney. They found Elijah outside, splitting firewood with steady, rhythmic swings of his axe. He saw them coming and stopped, leaning on the axe handle, waiting. Samuel didn't waste time with gentle approaches. He demanded to know what foolishness Elijah had been filling the Reverend's head with. He said no son of his would throw his life away on some twisted religious delusion. He said Elijah would get these ideas out of his head right now, immediately, or Samuel would lock him in the barn until sense returned. Elijah remained calm. He said this wasn't Samuel's decision to make. He was a grown man, and he'd made his choice. He was going to do what God required of him. Samuel's face flushed red. He stepped forward, grabbing Elijah's shoulder, his grip tight enough to hurt. He said God didn't require anything of the sort. God didn't want Elijah dead. What God wanted was for Elijah to live a normal life, to marry, to have children, to work and be useful. Not to kill himself like a coward running from responsibility. That word, coward, struck something in Elijah. His calm expression finally cracked. He pushed his father's hand away, his voice rising for the first time. He said he wasn't a coward. This took more courage than Samuel could possibly understand. Dying was easy compared to watching children suffer, compared to doing nothing while God's punishment rained down on innocent people. The argument escalated. Samuel threatened. Elijah refused. The Reverend tried to mediate, his voice lost between them. Finally, Samuel grabbed Elijah by the front of his shirt, pulling him close, and told him that if he went through with this insanity, he would be damned not just in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of every person in Brimstone Parish. He would be remembered as a madman, nothing more. Elijah met his father's eyes without flinching. He said he didn't care how he was remembered. He only cared that the children would stop dying. Then he pulled free from his father's grip and walked back into his cabin, closing the door behind him. Samuel and Reverend Pierce stood in the clearing, staring at the closed door. Word of Elijah's plan spread through Brimstone Parish like wildfire through dead grass. The Reverend had told Samuel in confidence, but Samuel had told his wife, who had told her sister, who had told her husband, and by the next Sunday, every person in the parish knew that Elijah Thorne intended to kill himself in some misguided attempt to end their suffering. The reactions were mixed and complicated. Some people called Elijah insane, said he needed to be restrained for his own safety. Others were angry, viewing his plan as an insult to their faith and an affront to God. But there were also those who listened with a different kind of attention, who heard about Elijah's sacrifice and felt something stir in their chests, something that might have been hope. Sarah Brennan was one of those people. She had buried her daughter Margaret 3 months earlier, and the grief had hollowed her out until she felt like an empty shell walking through her days. When she heard about Elijah's plan, she sought him out. She came to his cabin on a Wednesday afternoon, walking alone through the woods. Elijah was inside, working on something at his table, when he heard the knock. He opened the door to find Sarah standing there, thin and pale, her eyes still carrying that empty distance they'd held since Margaret's death. Sarah asked if she could come in. Elijah hesitated, then stepped aside to let her enter. The cabin was sparse and clean, containing little beyond the essentials: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, shelves holding food and supplies, and his mother's Bible still open on the table. Sarah sat without being invited, her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing, just looked at Elijah with those hollow eyes. Then she spoke. She said she'd heard what he was planning to do. She said people in town were calling him crazy, saying he was sick in the head and needed help, but she wanted to know if it was true. Did he really believe his death would save them? Elijah sat across from her. He said yes, he believed it completely. God had shown him the path and he would follow it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion Elijah had seen in her face. She asked if he thought it would bring back the children who had already died. Would Margaret come back? Would any of them? Elijah's expression softened with something like compassion. He said no, the dead wouldn't return. But the living children would be saved. No more mothers would have to bury their babies. No more fathers would have to build small coffins. His death would stop the suffering that was still happening. Sarah was quiet again, tears running down her face. Then she said something that chilled Elijah despite the warmth of the cabin. She said she wished she could be the one to die instead. She said she'd prayed every night for God to take her life instead of Margaret's, but God hadn't listened. If what Elijah said was true, if one death could save so many, then she wanted to die. She had nothing left to live for anyway. Elijah reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. He told her that wasn't how it worked. The sacrifice had to be willing but also chosen. God had chosen him, not her. Her task was to live, to survive, to remember. His task was to die. They talked for another hour. Sarah asked questions about how he knew God had chosen him, about what would happen after, about whether he was afraid. Elijah answered each question with the same calm certainty he'd shown everyone else. He wasn't afraid, this was right, this was necessary. When Sarah finally left, walking back through the woods toward her empty house, Elijah sat alone in his cabin and felt the weight of what he'd seen in her eyes. He'd seen hope there, desperate and fragile, but real. Someone believed him. Someone understood. Over the next week, others came. Not many, but enough. Thomas Carver, who had buried his twin sons. Rachel McAllister's husband, James, looking for anything that might ease his wife's suffering. An old woman named Beth Hutchins, who had lost 3 grandchildren and wanted to believe their deaths had meaning. Each time, Elijah told them the same things. His death would end the curse. God would be satisfied. The rains would return, the fever would cease, and Brimstone Parish would be saved. He spoke with such conviction that some of them began to believe. They began to see him not as a madman, but as something else, something almost holy. But not everyone believed. Most people still thought Elijah was disturbed, dangerous to himself. Samuel Thorne tried twice more to change his son's mind, both times ending in arguments that resolved nothing. Reverend Pierce preached a sermon about the sanctity of life and the sin of self-destruction, his words clearly aimed at Elijah sitting in the back pew. Elijah ignored them all. His mind was made up. His path was clear. He had decided on November 15th as the day. November 15th arrived cold and grey, the sky pressing down on Brimstone Parish like a lid on a coffin. Elijah woke before dawn in his cabin, the darkness outside absolute and silent. He lay in bed for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle over him, then rose and dressed carefully in his best clothes, a black suit he'd worn only to funerals and weddings. His hands were steady as he buttoned his shirt, as he tied his boots, as he combed his hair in the small mirror hanging on the wall. He ate no breakfast. Instead, he sat at his table with his mother's Bible open before him, reading passages he'd memorized weeks ago. The words were familiar now, worn smooth by repetition, but they still filled him with that burning certainty. He was doing the right thing, he was fulfilling God's plan. At dawn, he closed the Bible and placed it carefully in the center of the table where it would be found. He'd written a letter explaining everything, his reasons and his hopes, and he placed this beside the Bible, weighted down with a stone so it wouldn't blow away when someone opened the door. Then he put on his coat, walked outside into the cold morning air, and began the walk toward Old Providence Church. The church stood on a hill overlooking the parish, its white clapboard walls visible from most of the surrounding farms. Elijah had chosen it deliberately. This was where the people gathered, where they prayed, where they sought meaning in their suffering. This was where his sacrifice would have the most power, the most significance. He arrived as the sun was rising, pale light filtering through the bare trees. The church was empty, its door unlocked as it always was. Elijah pushed it open and stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and candle wax greeting him. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, and stopped beneath the high rafters. He'd brought rope from his cabin, good strong hemp rope used for hauling timber. He'd measured it carefully, cut it to the right length. Now he stood looking up at the rafters, calculating distances, planning the mechanics of what he was about to do with the same careful attention he'd give to any carpentry project. But as Elijah stood there in the silent church, preparing to throw the rope over the beam, something unexpected happened. The door opened behind him. He turned, the rope in his hands, to see Sarah Brennan standing in the doorway. She wasn't alone. Behind her were Thomas Carver, James McAllister, Beth Hutchins, and 5 others. All people who had lost children. All people who had come to his cabin and listened to his words. All people who had begun to believe. Sarah spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. She said they'd come to witness. If Elijah was truly going to do this, if he was truly going to sacrifice himself for them, then they needed to be here. They needed to see it. They needed to be able to tell others what they had witnessed, to testify to the meaning of his death. Elijah stared at them, the rope still in his hands. He hadn't expected an audience. He'd imagined doing this alone, being found later by whoever came to open the church for Sunday services. But looking at their faces, at the desperate hope burning in their eyes, he understood that Sarah was right. His death needed witnesses. It needed people who would carry the story forward, who would explain to the doubters what had really happened here. He nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the rafters and threw the rope over the beam. It took 3 tries to get it positioned correctly, to get the noose tied with the proper knot. His hands remained steady throughout, his movements calm and deliberate. Behind him, the small group watched in silence. When everything was ready, Elijah climbed onto one of the pews, then stepped up onto its back, balancing carefully. The noose hung beside him, waiting. He reached for it, his fingers closing around the rough hemp, and for just a moment, the briefest instant, doubt flickered through his mind. What if he was wrong? What if this changed nothing? But he pushed the doubt away. He'd come too far to turn back now. Too many people were depending on him. He slipped the noose over his head, feeling its weight settle against his neck. He looked out at the small group of witnesses, at their tear-streaked faces, at their clasped hands. Then Elijah Thorne stepped off the pew and into empty air. The rope snapped tight with a sound like a breaking branch. Elijah's body jerked once violently, then hung swaying in the cold morning air. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His hands twitched briefly at his sides, then went still. The church was silent except for the creak of the rope against the rafter and the sound of Sarah Brennan sobbing. For a long moment, no one moved. They stood frozen, staring at Elijah's body, at what they had just witnessed. Then Thomas Carver stepped forward, his face pale and stricken. He reached up toward Elijah's legs, as if to pull him down, but Sarah grabbed his arm and stopped him. She said they needed to wait, needed to leave him there so others could see, so everyone would understand what Elijah had done. James McAllister was the first to leave. He walked out of the church quickly, almost running, and headed toward the nearest farm. Within an hour, word had spread through Brimstone Parish. People came in groups, walking up the hill to the church, pushing through its doors to see what couldn't possibly be true. They found Elijah's body still hanging from the rafters, surrounded by the small group of witnesses who refused to let anyone cut him down. Reverend Pierce arrived mid-morning, alerted by his wife who had heard the news from a neighbor. He rushed into the church and stopped dead at the sight before him. Elijah hanging lifeless from the rope, Sarah Brennan and the others standing guard around him like sentinels, the growing crowd of parish members filling the pews and spilling out the door. The Reverend's face went from shock to horror to fury in the space of seconds. He demanded to know why no one had cut Elijah down, why they were letting him hang there like some kind of grotesque spectacle. Sarah stepped forward to explain, her voice stronger now, filled with a conviction that matched what Elijah's had been. She said they were witnessing a sacrifice, a holy act that would save them all. They needed to honor it, not rush to undo it. The Reverend's response was sharp and immediate. He said this was no holy act. This was suicide, a sin against God and man. There was nothing sacred about what Elijah had done, nothing noble or meaningful. It was a tragedy born of delusion, and they were all complicit in it by standing here and calling it something it wasn't. But Sarah didn't back down. She said the Reverend was wrong, that he didn't understand because he hadn't lost what they had lost. She said Elijah had given his life willingly, just like Jesus, and his death would bring salvation to Brimstone Parish, just as Jesus' death had brought salvation to the world. The comparison to Jesus struck Reverend Pierce like a physical blow. He said that was blasphemy, that comparing Elijah's suicide to Christ's sacrifice was an abomination. He ordered everyone out of the church immediately so he could cut Elijah down and give him a proper burial, such as a suicide could receive. But the crowd didn't move. Some looked uncertain, torn between the Reverend's authority and Sarah's passionate conviction. Others looked at Elijah's body with something approaching reverence. A few were already whispering that maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was a sacrifice. Maybe Elijah's death would change things. Samuel Thorne arrived an hour later. He pushed through the crowd roughly, shoving people aside until he stood beneath his son's hanging body. He looked up at Elijah's face, at the purple bruising around his neck, at his open eyes, and something inside Samuel broke. He let out a sound that was half sob, half roar, then grabbed the rope and began pulling, trying to haul his son's body down through sheer force. Reverend Pierce helped him. Together they managed to lower Elijah to the floor, cutting the rope and laying him out on the wooden boards. Samuel knelt beside his son, his big hands shaking as they touched Elijah's cold face. He said nothing, just knelt there with his head bowed, his shoulders heaving. The crowd watched in silence. Some were crying now, the reality of what had happened finally sinking in. A man was dead. Elijah Thorne, quiet and strange but harmless, was dead by his own hand. Whatever he had believed, whatever he had hoped to accomplish, he was gone. But Sarah Brennan wasn't crying. She stood tall, her eyes bright with something fierce. She said it wasn't over, that they needed to wait and see. Elijah had promised his death would end the suffering, and she believed him. She said they all needed to believe. They buried Elijah Thorne 3 days later in the church cemetery, though not without considerable debate. Suicides were traditionally buried outside consecrated ground, in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. But the small group who had witnessed Elijah's death insisted he deserved a proper burial in the main cemetery. They argued, they pleaded, and eventually they wore down Reverend Pierce's resistance through sheer persistence. The funeral was attended by almost everyone in Brimstone Parish. Some came out of genuine grief, others out of curiosity, and still others because not attending would have marked them as outsiders in a community that was already fracturing along new lines. Those who believed Elijah had been a martyr stood on one side of the grave. Those who believed he had been mentally ill stood on the other. The division was visible, physical, impossible to ignore. Reverend Pierce conducted the service with visible reluctance. His sermon was brief and carefully worded, speaking about God's mercy and the mystery of suffering without endorsing or condemning Elijah's actions. He prayed for Elijah's soul and for the comfort of those who mourned him. Then they lowered the pine coffin into the ground, and it was done. Samuel Thorne stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left. He stared down at the fresh earth covering his son, his face unreadable. When he finally walked away, he went not to his own home, but to Elijah's cabin. He found the letter his son had left, read it once, then burned it in the fireplace. Whatever Elijah had written, whatever justifications or explanations he'd offered, Samuel didn't want them preserved. He wanted them gone. In the days following the funeral, Brimstone Parish waited. The believers waited for signs that Elijah's sacrifice had worked. They watched the sky for rain clouds. They monitored their children for any signs of fever. They looked for anything, any small change that might indicate God had accepted Elijah's offering. The sky remained grey and dry. No rain fell. The drought continued unbroken. The Cumberland River still reduced to a muddy trickle. And on the 4th day after Elijah's death, another child fell sick with the fever. Timothy Walsh, aged 9, woke with the same burning skin and glazed eyes that had marked the beginning of the end for 14 other children. Sarah Brennan heard the news while working in her garden. She dropped her tools and ran to the Walsh house, bursting through the door without knocking. She found Timothy's mother, Ellen, sitting beside her son's bed, with tears streaming down her face. Sarah grabbed Ellen's shoulders, shaking her, demanding to know if it was true. Was Timothy really sick? Was it the same fever? Ellen nodded, unable to speak. Sarah released her and stepped back, her face crumbling. She said it wasn't possible, that Elijah had promised, that his death was supposed to end this. Ellen looked at her with something like pity and said maybe Elijah had been wrong. Maybe he'd died for nothing. Those words, died for nothing, spread through the parish faster than the fever ever had. By evening everyone knew Timothy Walsh was sick and Elijah Thorne's sacrifice had changed nothing. The believers began to doubt. Had they been fools to think one man's death could alter God's will? Had they encouraged Elijah's delusion instead of stopping it? Thomas Carver went to Reverend Pierce's house that night, his face haggard. He said he needed to confess something. He said he'd believed Elijah, had watched him die and thought it was holy, but now he understood it had been murder. Not legal murder, but moral murder. They had all stood by and let Elijah kill himself, and now they had to live with that knowledge. The Reverend received his confession with weary compassion. He said they had all been desperate, all looking for meaning in senseless tragedy, and Elijah had offered them a story that made sense of their suffering. It wasn't surprising they'd wanted to believe it. But wanting something to be true didn't make it true. God didn't work through suicide. God didn't require blood sacrifices from confused men with ropes and rafters. Timothy Walsh died 6 days after falling sick, the same progression as all the children before him. His funeral was small and quiet, and no one spoke of Elijah Thorne. The believers had gone silent, ashamed. The doubters felt vindicated, but took no pleasure in it. Everyone simply grieved. Winter came to Brimstone Parish with a vengeance. Snow fell in heavy sheets, covering the tobacco fields and timber mills, making the roads impassable for days at a time. The cold was brutal, settling into bones and houses with equal determination. People huddled by their fires and waited for spring, for warmth, for any kind of relief from the endless succession of hardships. The fever finally burned itself out in January, not through divine intervention, but through the simple mathematics of contagion. It had run through every susceptible child in the parish, and those who had survived were now immune. No divine intervention, no miracle, just the brutal natural course of disease reaching its conclusion. By February the rains returned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, steadily, until the Cumberland River began to rise again, and the wells started to refill. The drought broke the way droughts always break, not through sacrifice or prayer, but through the shifting of weather patterns too large and complex for human understanding. Brimstone Parish began to heal, though the scars ran deep. 15 children were dead, 15 families broken. Elijah Thorne was dead, his father permanently changed by grief and guilt. The community itself was fractured, divided between those who had believed and those who hadn't, with trust and fellowship damaged perhaps beyond repair. Sarah Brennan left the parish in March. She packed her belongings into a wagon and departed without saying goodbye to anyone, headed west toward relatives in Arkansas. People said she couldn't bear to stay in a place that held so many painful memories. Others whispered that she'd left because she was ashamed of what she'd encouraged, of how she'd turned Elijah's suicide into some kind of holy martyrdom. Samuel Thorne sold his timber business that same spring. He couldn't work anymore, couldn't stand to be in the mill where Elijah had worked beside him for so many years. He sold everything and moved to Chattanooga with his wife and remaining sons, leaving behind the house and land that had been his family's for generations. Reverend Pierce stayed, but something in him had changed. His sermons became more focused on doubt and struggle, on the difficulty of faith in the face of suffering. He stopped offering easy answers or comfortable certainties. He spoke more honestly about his own questions, his own failures to understand God's ways. Some people appreciated this new honesty, others found it unsettling and stopped attending services. The cabin where Elijah had lived stood empty for several years. No one wanted to buy it or live in it. Eventually it fell into disrepair. the roof collapsing under snow, the walls rotting until it was nothing but ruins in the woods. People avoided that part of the forest, especially at dusk when shadows grew long. There were stories about seeing lights in the ruins, about hearing sounds like rope creaking. But these were just stories, the kind communities tell to make sense of tragedy. Time passed. New children were born in Brimstone Parish. New families moved in to replace those who had left. The wounds began to heal, though they never fully closed. People still marked time by that terrible autumn of 1882, saying things happened before the fever or after the fever, using it as a dividing line in their personal histories. And Elijah Thorne became a story, a cautionary tale told to children and newcomers. The man who thought his death could save everyone. The man who confused his own delusions with divine calling. The man whose sacrifice blessed no one, saved no one, meant nothing beyond the simple tragic fact of a life unnecessarily ended. His grave in the church cemetery acquired no special significance. People didn't visit it or leave flowers. It was just one more stone among many, marking one more death in a community that had seen too many deaths in too short a time. The inscription was simple. Samuel had insisted on that. Just his name and his dates. Nothing about sacrifice or martyrdom or God's will. Elijah Thorne, 1850-1882. In the end, that was all there was. A name, 2 dates, and the hollow space between them where a life had been, a life that ended believing it would mean something, that it would change something, that it would matter. But Brimstone Parish continued without him, its suffering neither eased nor explained by his death, its people no more saved than they had ever been. The hollow martyr had blessed no one, and the parish remembered him only as a reminder of how desperation and delusion could twist faith into something dangerous and dark. And when winter came again, and spring after that, and all the seasons continued their endless cycle, Elijah Thorne's name was spoken less and less, until finally it wasn't spoken at all, and he became what everyone eventually becomes, forgotten. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.